Sometimes the deepest loneliness comes not from being alone, but from being surrounded by family who no longer see who you really are. Lady Elenora knew this pain well as she stood in the morning mist outside the old chapel, watching her grown children whisper and point at her with cruel amusement. The 4-year-old widow had shocked everyone by marrying a homeless wanderer she'd found sleeping among the chapel ruins. Her family called her foolish, said grief had broken her mind. They saw only his torn cloak and dirty hands, missing the kindness in his tired eyes. But Elenora had lived long enough to recognize something her family couldn't see. This stranger carried secrets deeper than her own heartache, older than the stones beneath their feet. What happens when the beggar you marry out of compassion turns out to be more powerful than kings? Before we continue, tell us where you're listening from, and if this story moves you, subscribe, because tomorrow we have something extraordinary waiting. The cracked bronze bell that crowned the ancient chapel had not rung in decades, its voice silenced by time and neglect, just as Eleonora's own had been quieted by years of proper widowhood. She traced her fingers along the cold metal as dawn broke over the village of Ravensmoor, painting the mist-shrouded stones in shades of pearl and gold. The bell bore the scars of its age, deep fissures that spoke of storms weathered and battles survived, much like the woman who stood beneath it. Lady Elenora de Montclair had once been the pride of this valley. 26 years ago, she had married Lord Edmund, with all the fanfare befitting a union between two noble houses. The chapel bells had rung then, their joyous voices carrying across the countryside to announce a love match that had surprised everyone. Edmund had been kind, patient, and devoted, a gentle soul who understood that true partnership required both passion and friendship. For 18 years, they had been blessed. Elenora had borne 3 children, Marcus, now 31, and lord of his own estate, Catherine, 28, and married to a wealthy merchant, and young Thomas, 24, and eager to make his mark upon the world. Their home had been filled with laughter, music, and the comfortable rhythms of a life well lived. Edmund had treated her as an equal, seeking her counsel on matters both great and small, never once suggesting that her opinions held less weight because she was a woman. Then the fever came. It had started as nothing more than a slight chill on a September morning. Within a week, Edmund was burning with heat that no remedy could touch. Within 2 weeks, he was gone, leaving behind a woman who suddenly found herself transformed from beloved wife to grieving relic. The funeral had been grand, befitting a lord of Edmund's standing, but the moment the last prayer was spoken, Elenora discovered how quickly love could turn to burden in the eyes of others. Her children, once so dependent upon her guidance, now viewed her with a mixture of pity and impatience. Marcus, inheriting his father's title but none of his wisdom, immediately began managing her affairs as if she had lost her capacity for thought, along with her husband. Catherine, always sharp-tongued, grew cruel in her assessments of her mother's choices, questioning everything from her expenditures to her friendships. And Thomas, sweet Thomas, simply avoided her altogether, as if her grief might be contagious. The village that had once celebrated her now whispered behind gloved hands. "Poor Lady Elenora," they murmured, growing strange in her solitude. She spent too much time reading, too much time walking the countryside alone, too much time visiting the chapel where she and Edmund had wed. They spoke as if widowhood had made her fragile, incapable of managing her own life, despite the fact that she had successfully run their household for nearly 2 decades. But it was the loneliness that proved most devastating, not the solitude. Elenora had always treasured quiet moments, but the profound isolation that came from being surrounded by people who no longer truly saw her. To her children, she had become a responsibility to be managed. To the village, she had become an object of pity to be discussed. To the world at large, she had simply ceased to matter in any meaningful way. This morning was different, though. This morning marked exactly 1 year since she had made the decision that scandalized everyone who knew her. The memory was as clear as the mountain air around them. She had been kneeling in the ruins of the old chapel, seeking solace among the broken stones and wild flowers that grew between the cracks. It was here that she felt closest to Edmund, not in the grand new chapel where they held formal services, but in these ancient ruins where love felt timeless and unbound by earthly concerns. That was when she had seen him. At first, she had thought him dead. He lay so still among the fallen stones, his dark cloak spread around him like wings, his face pale as moonlight. But as she approached, she had seen the gentle rise and fall of his chest, had noticed the way his lips parted slightly as he breathed. Even in sleep, there had been something about his features that spoke of nobility, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, hands that were calloused from work but elegant in their form. She should have summoned help. A proper lady would have sent for the village men to deal with the vagrant sleeping in sacred ground. Instead, she had found herself studying his face, noting the lines of sorrow etched around his eyes, the way his brow furrowed even in sleep, as if he could find no peace, even in dreams. When he had awakened to find her there, his first words had not been excuses or pleas for charity. Instead, he had simply said, "Forgive me, my lady, I meant no disrespect to this holy place." His voice had been like aged, wine-rich, deep, with an accent she could not quite place. There had been education in his speech, refinement that spoke of a very different life than his current circumstances suggested. When he had moved to rise, she had seen him wince, favoring his left side as if nursing some old injury. "Please," she had said, surprising herself, "rest. This place has sheltered many travelers over the centuries." And so had begun the most unlikely friendship of her life. Aaron, he had told her no family name, claimed he had forgotten it long ago, had become a fixture in her daily walks to the chapel. At first, their conversations had been simple exchanges of courtesy. He had asked after her health, she had inquired about his needs. Gradually, however, their talks had deepened. He listened when she spoke of Edmund, never offering empty platitudes or rushing to change the subject as others did. Instead, he would nod thoughtfully and sometimes share fragments of his own losses, speaking of loved ones gone so long that their memory had taken on the quality of dreams. There was something ageless about his wisdom, as if he had lived long enough to understand that all human sorrows were echoes of the same fundamental loneliness. He quoted poetry she did not recognize, spoke of places she had never heard of, and demonstrated a knowledge of human nature that seemed born of deep experience rather than mere observation. More importantly, he saw her, not as a pitiable widow or a burden to be managed, but as a woman with thoughts worth hearing and opinions worth considering. When she mentioned her concerns about village politics or her observations about human behavior, he engaged with genuine interest. When she shared her memories of Edmund, he listened without judgment or the uncomfortable shifting that characterized most people's response to grief. It had been Marcus who first noticed her regular absences from the manor. Her eldest son had arrived for his monthly visit, 3 months after her initial encounter with Aaron, demanding to know why the servants reported her spending so much time at the old ruins. "It brings me peace," she had explained, but Marcus had dismissed this with the casual cruelty that had become his trademark since Edmund's death. "Mother, this obsession with the past is unhealthy. Father is gone, and these romantic walks to crumbling stones serve no purpose except to feed your melancholy. You need to focus on practical matters, your household, your social obligations, your responsibilities to the family name." She had not told him about Aaron then. Some instinct had warned her that her children would not understand, would see only the surface strangeness of a noblewoman befriending a vagrant. They would assume madness or desperation, never considering that she might have found something precious in an unexpected place. The decision to marry him had crystallized on a rain-soaked afternoon in early autumn. She had found Aaron shivering in the ruins, his thin cloak providing little protection against the growing cold. He had been preparing to leave, he told her, to seek shelter in the next valley before winter made travel impossible. "Stay," she had said, the word escaping before she could consider its implications. He had looked at her with those strange ancient eyes, grey like storm clouds, but shot through with flecks of gold that seemed to catch light from impossible sources. "My lady, I cannot. Your reputation—" "My reputation is already in tatters," she had interrupted. "They whisper about my strange habits and my melancholy moods. What harm could there be in one more scandal?" But even as she spoke the words lightly, she had realized they were not quite true. The invitation had not been born of recklessness, but of recognition. In Aaron, she had found the first person in years who treated her as if her thoughts mattered, as if her company was desired rather than endured. More than that, she had sensed in him the same deep loneliness that plagued her own days, the same hunger for genuine connection. The proposal, when it came, had been as unconventional as everything else about their relationship. She had spoken it herself, sitting among the chapel ruins, as autumn leaves fell around them like blessings. "I have been thinking," she had begun carefully, "about the nature of companionship in the later years of life." Aaron had waited, neither encouraging nor discouraging, simply present in the way that had become so precious to her. "Society expects widows to live in perpetual mourning," she had continued, "to shrink into the shadows and trouble no one with our continued existence. But I find myself wondering if there might be another way, a path that honors the past while still allowing for the possibility of future joy." Still, he had remained silent, though she had seen something shift in his expression. "I am proposing a marriage of companionship," she had said finally, the words clear and firm despite her racing heart. "A union between two souls who have known loss and found in each other the comfort of true understanding. I offer you shelter, respect, and whatever affection an aging heart can provide. In return, I ask only for your presence, your conversation, and your patience with a woman who has forgotten how to live for herself." The silence that followed had stretched so long, she had begun to fear she had misunderstood everything, had seen connection where none existed. Then Aaron had reached for her hands the first time he had ever touched her, and she had felt a shock of something she could not name. "My lady," he had said softly, "there are things about me you do not know, things that might change your mind if—" "I know enough," she had interrupted. "I know that you are kind, intelligent, and alone. I know that you listen when I speak, and that your presence brings me peace. What more could any reasonable person require?" Now, standing in the morning mist exactly 1 year later, Elenora reflected on how that simple ceremony had changed everything. The village priest had been reluctant to perform the service, questioning both her decision and Aaron's suitability. Her children had been appalled, then furious, then coldly dismissive. The village had buzzed with gossip for weeks, some pitying her madness, others condemning her impropriety. But in the quiet moments between the storms of public opinion, she had discovered something wonderful. She was no longer alone. Aaron had proven to be everything she had hoped, and more. He was unfailingly courteous, deeply thoughtful, and possessed of a gentle humor that had brought laughter back to her days. He was also surprisingly knowledgeable about household management, helping her make improvements to the manor that even Edmund might not have thought to implement. There were mysteries about him, certainly. He kept strange hours, often walking the grounds at night when sleep eluded him. He ate little in her presence, claiming his appetite was poor, though she never found evidence that he took meals elsewhere. Sometimes she would catch him staring into the distance with an expression of such profound sadness that her heart ached for whatever memories haunted him. But these small oddities paled beside the larger truth. For the first time since Edmund's death, she felt truly alive. The sound of approaching footsteps broke her reverie. She turned to see Marcus striding toward the chapel, his face set in the hard lines she had learned to dread. Behind him walked Catherine and Thomas, their expressions ranging from concerned to embarrassed. This was to be another intervention, then another attempt to shame her back into proper widowhood. Elenora touched the cracked bell one more time, drawing strength from its endurance. Some things, she reflected, were worth ringing for, even if the sound they made was imperfect. Some truths were worth defending, even if the world could not yet understand them. As her children approached, she straightened her shoulders and prepared to fight once again for the right to love where and how she chose. "Mother, this has gone quite far enough." Marcus's voice cut through the morning air like a blade, sharp with the authority he had assumed since his father's death. He stood before her in his finest traveling clothes, every inch the lord he believed himself to be, though Elenora could still see traces of the uncertain boy who had once sought her comfort after nightmares. "Good morning to you as well, Marcus," Elenora replied evenly, refusing to let his tone rattle her composure. "Catherine, Thomas, how lovely to see you all together, though I confess I'm surprised by this early visit." Catherine stepped forward, her silk gown rustling with each deliberate movement. At 28, she had grown into a woman of sharp angles and sharper words, her beauty marred by the perpetual expression of disapproval she wore like a shield. "We've come to discuss your situation, Mother. This ridiculous charade has damaged our family's reputation long enough." "My marriage, you mean?" Eleonora's voice remained calm, though her fingers tightened slightly around the small scroll. She carried a piece of ancient parchment. Aaron had found tucked into the chapel's foundation stones just yesterday. The words written upon it had been barely legible, something about the first of the blood-cursed, but she had not yet had time to decipher its full meaning. "Marriage?" Thomas finally spoke, his young face flushed with embarrassment. "Mother, you cannot call that mockery a true marriage. The man is a vagrant, a beggar who has obviously taken advantage of your grief-stricken state." The casual cruelty in her youngest son's voice struck her like a physical blow. This was Thomas, who had once brought her wildflowers and begged for extra stories at bedtime. Now he looked at her with the same mixture of pity and disdain she had grown to hate from the rest of the village. "Aaron is my husband," she said firmly. "Married before God and witnessed by the priest. I fail to see what concern this is of yours." "What concern?" Marcus's voice rose, causing several ravens to take flight from the chapel ruins. "Mother, you have made us the laughingstock of 3 counties. Do you have any idea what people are saying?" "I can imagine. People always find something to say when others choose paths they don't understand." "They're saying you've lost your mind," Catherine interjected bluntly. "They're saying grief has driven you to madness, that you're so desperate for male companionship you've married the first vagrant who showed you kindness." Elenora felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame, but from anger. "And what do you think, Catherine? Do you believe your mother has lost her mind?" Her daughter's hesitation was answer enough. "The man doesn't even have a billier." "Proper name," Marcus continued, pressing his advantage. "No family, no history, no property. For all we know, he could be a criminal fleeing justice, or worse." "If only you knew," Elenora thought, remembering the strange incidents that had begun shortly after her marriage. The way animals seemed to avoid Aaron entirely, how mirrors reflected only her image when they stood together, the careful way he avoided direct sunlight whenever possible. Yesterday's discovery of the ancient parchment had only added to the growing collection of small mysteries that surrounded her husband. But these oddities, rather than frightening her, had only deepened her affection for him. Whatever secrets Aaron carried, she sensed they were born of sorrow rather than malice. There was a gentleness in him, a careful consideration of others that spoke to a good heart, regardless of what supernatural circumstances might surround him. "His past is his own business," she said aloud, "as is my choice in companions." Not when it affects the family name, Marcus snapped. Father built our reputation over decades of careful alliances and proper behavior. I will not see it destroyed because you've developed romantic fantasies about some mysterious stranger. The mention of Edmund sparked something fierce in Eleonora's chest. Do not presume to speak for your father, Marcus. Edmund believed in looking beyond surface appearances to judge a person's true character. He would have taken the time to know Aaron before passing judgment. Father would have had the man investigated before allowing him anywhere near our family, Catherine said coldly, which is exactly what we've done. Elenora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What do you mean? Thomas pulled a folded document from his coat, his expression almost apologetic. We hired investigators, Mother. Men who specialize in uncovering the truth about people with questionable pasts. And they found nothing, Marcus admitted grudgingly. No records of his birth, no mention of his family, no trace of his existence before he appeared in our village. It's as if he materialized from thin air. The scroll in Eleonora's hand seemed to grow heavier. She thought of the cryptic words she had glimpsed, warnings about something called the first of the blood-cursed. Could it refer to Aaron? The phrase had an ancient quality that matched the timeless sorrow she sometimes saw in her husband's eyes. Perhaps, she said carefully, some people prefer to leave their pasts behind. Perhaps they have good reasons for seeking a fresh start. Or perhaps, Catherine said with vicious satisfaction, they have something terrible to hide. Before Elenora could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps made them all turn. Aaron emerged from the morning mist like a figure from legend, his dark cloak billowing around him, his pale features serene despite the obvious tension of the gathering. In the early light, there was something almost otherworldly about his appearance, too graceful, too quiet, too perfectly composed for a mere mortal man. "My lady," he said softly, offering Elenora a slight bow before turning to face her children. "Young lords, my lady Catherine, I hope I am not intruding upon a family gathering." The formal courtesy of his address seemed to catch her children off guard. They had expected cowering subservience or crude defensiveness, not the dignified bearing of someone accustomed to respect. "Not at all," Elenora said warmly, moving to stand beside her husband. "We were simply discussing family matters." Marcus stepped forward aggressively. "You're exactly the man I wanted to see. I think it's time we had a frank discussion about your intentions regarding my mother." Aaron's expression remained calm, though Elenora noticed his hands had moved to clasp behind his back. A gesture she had learned indicated he was exercising careful control over his emotions. "I intend only to honor her as my wife and to provide whatever companionship and protection she will accept," Aaron replied evenly. "Protection?" Catherine laughed harshly. "What protection could you possibly offer? You own nothing, have no family connections, no resources of any kind. What exactly are you protecting her from?" For just a moment, something flickered behind Aaron's grey eyes, something old and dangerous that made the morning air seem suddenly colder. Then it was gone, replaced by the gentle sadness that Elenora had come to recognize as his default expression. "From loneliness, my lady. From the cruelty of those who believe age and widowhood diminish a woman's worth." The quiet dignity of his response seemed to shame even Catherine into momentary silence. Thomas, perhaps emboldened by his sibling's presence, stepped closer. "We know you're hiding something. No man appears from nowhere without a past. Whatever you're running from, whatever you've done, we'll find out eventually." This time, the dangerous flicker lasted longer. When Aaron spoke, his voice carried a subtle weight that made the young man involuntarily step backward. "I have done many things in my long life, young lord. Some I regret deeply. But I have never harmed your mother, nor do I intend to. My only desire is to spend whatever time remains to me in her gracious company." "Long life," Marcus seized on the phrase. "You can't be more than 40. What could you possibly mean by enough? Eleonora's voice cut through the growing tension like a bell, clear and commanding. She had endured their accusations and insults long enough. It was time to make her position unmistakably clear. I will hear no more of this interrogation. Aaron is my husband, chosen freely and married lawfully. Your approval was neither sought nor required. If you cannot treat him with the respect due to a member of this family, then you are not welcome in my presence. The stunned silence that followed her declaration stretched uncomfortably long. Her children had never heard her speak with such authority, such finality. For years, they had grown accustomed to her quiet acceptance of their decisions and opinions. This new Elenora, confident, decisive, protective, was a stranger to them. Mother, Marcus began uncertainly. The discussion is over, she said firmly. You may either accept my choice and welcome my husband into our family, or you may leave and not return until you can do so with proper courtesy. She could see the war playing out on their faces, the desire to continue the argument, warring with shock at her unexpected strength. In the end, it was Catherine who broke first. Very well, she said coldly. But when this man's true nature is finally revealed, when he shows himself to be the fraud we know him to be, do not expect sympathy from any of us. With that, she turned and stalked away, her siblings following reluctantly behind. Only Thomas looked back, his young face troubled with something that might have been regret. When they were alone again, Elenora felt the strength leave her legs. She sank onto a fallen stone, the ancient parchment still clutched in her trembling hands. "I'm sorry you had to endure that," she whispered. Aaron knelt beside her, his cool fingers gently covering hers. "My dear lady, you defended me with a courage that would shame knights. It is I who should apologize for bringing such discord into your family." She looked up into his strange, beautiful eyes and saw the weight of centuries in their depths. Whatever secrets he carried, whatever the parchment might reveal about his true nature, she found she no longer cared. This man, this being, had given her back her sense of worth, her voice, her strength. "No apologies," she said firmly. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." As if summoned by her words, a raven landed on the chapel bell above them, its black eyes fixed unblinkingly on Aaron's pale face. For just a moment, Elenora could have sworn she saw the creature bow its head in what looked remarkably like respect before taking flight once more. The first of the blood-cursed, the parchment had warned. Looking at her husband's noble profile in the morning light, Elenora wondered if she was about to discover exactly what that meant. The silver cross had belonged to Eleonora's grandmother, a woman of fierce faith and gentle wisdom who had worn it every day until her death. It was a simple piece, not ornate like the jewelry favored by nobility, but elegant in its restraint, with delicate engravings that caught the light like captured prayers. Elenora had treasured it since childhood, finding comfort in its familiar weight against her chest during times of uncertainty. She had been wearing it that first morning after the confrontation with her children, when Aaron had reached across the breakfast table to brush a crumb from her cheek. His fingers had accidentally caught the chain, pulling the cross against his palm for just an instant before he jerked his hand away with a sharp intake of breath. The smell of burning flesh had been unmistakable. "Forgive me," he had said quickly, cradling his injured hand against his chest. "I was clumsy." The metal was warm from the fire. But there had been no fire in the breakfast room, and the cross had not been warm. Elenora had seen the angry red mark on his palm, perfectly matching the shape of the cross, before he had hidden his hand beneath the table. More telling still had been the look in his eyes, not pain, but resignation, as if he had expected such a reaction and was merely disappointed to have his suspicions confirmed. They had not spoken of the incident, but it had changed something between them. Elenora found herself watching her husband more carefully, noting the small oddities she had previously dismissed as eccentricities of his unusual background. Now, 3 days later, as autumn settled more deeply into the valley, she was beginning to piece together a picture that both frightened and fascinated her. Aaron never ate meals in her presence, claiming his appetite was poor, yet the servants reported that no food ever went missing from the kitchens. He slept little, often walking the manor grounds long into the night, moving with a silence that seemed almost supernatural. Most disturbing of all, she had begun to notice that mirrors throughout the house reflected only her own image when they stood together, as if her husband cast no reflection at all. These discoveries should have terrified her. Any rational woman would have fled or summoned the church authorities. Instead, Elenora found herself studying Aaron with growing tenderness, seeing not a monster, but a soul carrying an unimaginable burden. This evening, she sat in her private chamber, watching as he stood before the tall window that overlooked the village below. The last light of day painted his pale features in shades of gold and amber, though he was careful to keep to the shadows as the sun lingered on the horizon. There was a terrible beauty in his stillness, a sense of someone who had learned to find peace in solitude because companionship had been denied him for far too long. "The villagers are talking again," she said softly, not wanting to startle him from his contemplation. He turned, offering her a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "They always are, my dear. What new scandal have we provided for their entertainment?" "Mrs. Hartwell claims she saw you walking the churchyard at midnight. She insists you were speaking with the dead." To her surprise, Aaron chuckled, a sound like distant thunder, rich and warm despite the sadness that tinged it. "Mrs. Hartwell sees many things that exist primarily in her imagination, though I confess I do find graveyards peaceful at night. There's an honesty to them that daylight lacks." "An honesty?" "The dead make no pretense about what they are. They neither judge nor demand explanations. Sometimes that can be a great comfort to those of us who—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "To those of us who feel displaced among the living." Elenora rose from her chair and moved to stand beside him at the window. Below them, the village was settling into evening routines, mothers calling children in for supper, shopkeepers closing their doors, workers making their way home after long days. It was a scene of ordinary human contentment, yet she sensed it brought Aaron more pain than pleasure to observe. "Do you miss it?" she asked quietly. "Being part of that world?" His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with a careful gentleness that spoke of great strength held in check. "I'm not certain I was ever truly part of it, even when I thought I was. But I miss the illusion of belonging, yes. I miss believing that I had a place among ordinary people living ordinary lives." The melancholy in his voice made her heart ache. Without thinking, she reached up to touch his cheek, marveling at how cool his skin felt despite the warmth of the room. "You have a place now. Here, with me." He turned to face her fully, his grey eyes searching her features as if trying to memorize every detail. "My beloved Elenora, you are far too generous with your heart. You've given me something I thought lost forever, and I fear I can never adequately repay such a gift. You repay it every day, simply by being here, by choosing to stay when you could have moved on to the next valley, the next village, the next chance for solitude. You don't understand," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There are things about me, things you don't know. Then tell me." The simple words hung between them like a challenge. Aaron stepped back, releasing her hand, his expression cycling through what looked like a dozen different emotions before settling on something that might have been fear. "I cannot. Not yet. Perhaps not ever." "Why?" "Because once you know the truth, everything will change. This peace we've found together, this brief respite from loneliness, it will shatter like glass. and I will lose you just as I have lost everyone else I have ever dared to care for." The raw pain in his voice broke something open in Eleonora's chest. She moved toward him, ignoring his instinctive retreat, and took his face between her hands. "Listen to me very carefully," she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I have lived 54 years on this earth. I have buried parents, siblings, friends, and a beloved husband. I have raised 3 children who now look at me as if I am a burden to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. I have been pitied, dismissed, and ignored by people who once sought my counsel and friendship." She paused, making sure he was truly listening. "In all that time, I have learned to recognize the difference between surface appearances and fundamental character. Whatever you think I might discover about your past or your nature, whatever secrets you believe would drive me away, understand this: I have already seen your soul, and it is beautiful." For a moment, she thought he might speak, might finally trust her with whatever truth had driven him to a life of wandering solitude. Instead, he pulled her hands away from his face and stepped back, his expression closing off once more. "You are remarkable," he said quietly, "but you are also wrong. Some truths are too terrible to share, too dangerous to speak aloud. I will not be the cause of your destruction, no matter how much I long for your complete understanding." Before she could protest, he was moving toward the door, his movements carrying that unsettling grace she had noticed from their first meeting. "Where are you going?" "To walk the grounds, to think, to remember why isolation is sometimes the kindest gift we can offer those we love." And then he was gone, leaving Elenora alone with her questions and the lingering scent of something she could not identify, something that reminded her of ancient forests and moonlit nights and sorrows older than memory. She remained at the window long after darkness had claimed the valley, watching for his return. When she finally glimpsed his solitary figure moving through the gardens below, she noticed something that made her breath catch. He cast no shadow in the moonlight, moving like a ghost across the silver-touched grass. Whatever he was hiding, whatever truth he feared would drive her away, Elenora found her resolve only strengthening. Tomorrow, she would begin her own investigation. If Aaron would not trust her with his secrets, then she would uncover them herself. And when she did, when she finally understood the full truth of what he was, she would prove to him that love could indeed survive any revelation, no matter how extraordinary or terrible it might be. The moonstone pendant arrived, with no explanation, simply appearing on Eleonora's pillow like a gift from the night itself. It was exquisite in its simplicity, a perfectly smooth oval of pale stone that seemed to capture and hold moonlight within its depths, suspended from a delicate silver chain that felt warm despite the cool morning air. When she lifted it to the window, the stone pulsed with a gentle luminescence that defied rational explanation. Aaron had already departed for his morning walk by the time she discovered it, but his presence lingered in the carefully straightened bedclothes on his side of the bed, the side where he lay each night without truly sleeping, his breathing so quiet she sometimes wondered if he breathed at all. She had grown accustomed to waking alone, though she always found evidence that he had spent the night hours watching over her. A book moved closer to her reading chair, fresh flowers placed in the vase by her window, or simply the sense that the shadows had been kept at bay by his protective presence. When he returned from his walk, she was waiting in the breakfast room with the pendant clasped around her neck. The effect on him was immediate and profound. He stopped in the doorway as if struck, his pale features cycling through surprise, pleasure, and something that looked almost like pain. "You found my gift?" he said softly, approaching her with the careful movements she had learned indicated strong emotion held in check. "It's beautiful," she replied, touching the stone where it rested against her throat, "though I confess I'm curious about its origin. This doesn't look like anything that could be found in our village markets." He sat across from her at the small table they had claimed for their private meals, his grey eyes fixed on the pendant with an intensity that made her skin warm. "It belonged to someone very dear to me, long ago. I've carried it for more years than you. Might imagine waiting for the right person to wear it again. Someone you loved, someone I failed to protect." The words carried the weight of old grief, deep as winter frost. "Her name was Liana, and she died because of what I am." Elenora felt her breath catch. This was the closest he had come to speaking directly about his true nature, about the secrets that cast such shadows across his features when he thought she wasn't watching. What happened to her? Aaron was quiet for so long, she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the distant quality of someone recounting events from another lifetime. "She was kind to me when others were not. She saw past the strangeness, the otherness that marked me as different. Like you, she believed in looking beyond surface appearances to judge character." He touched the table where her hand rested, but did not quite make contact. "And like you, she paid a price for her compassion." "How did she die?" "Fear," he said simply. "The same fear that drives men to destroy what they don't understand. When they discovered what I was, they couldn't separate her kindness from my supposed evil. She became guilty by association." The pendant seemed to pulse with warm light against Eleonora's skin, as if responding to the emotion in his voice. She found herself thinking of her children's cruel words, of the village gossip that followed her everywhere now, of the way people whispered and pointed when she walked through the marketplace. "You're afraid the same thing will happen to me." It wasn't a question, and he didn't treat it as one. Instead, he finally reached across the table to cover her hand with his touch cool as always, but somehow comforting despite the supernatural chill. "I am afraid that my selfishness in accepting your offer of marriage has already set events in motion that I cannot control. I am afraid that your generous heart will be the weapon others use to destroy you." Before Elenora could respond, the sound of raised voices from the front courtyard interrupted their conversation. Through the window, she could see a cluster of villagers gathered near the manor gates, their faces animated with the particular excitement that accompanied fresh gossip. At the center of the group stood Father Benedict, the village priest, his black robes making him look like a raven among sparrows. "It seems word of our conversation yesterday has reached interesting ears," Aaron observed quietly, though tension had crept into his posture. Elenora rose and moved to the window for a better view. Among the villagers, she recognized several faces that had once been friendly. Mrs. Hartwell, who had brought soup when Edmund was dying. Master Cooper, who had always greeted her warmly at market. Even young Sarah Miller, whose children Elenora had helped deliver. Now they all wore expressions ranging from concern to outright suspicion, their eyes fixed on her home as if it harbored something dangerous. "What are they saying?" she murmured, though she suspected she already knew. As if summoned by her words, Father Benedict approached the window. He was a man in his 50s, thin and sharp-featured, who had always struck Elenora as someone more concerned with the letter of religious law than its spirit. His dark eyes found hers through the glass, and his expression was grave. "Lady Elenora," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Might I have a word? There are concerns that need to be addressed." Aaron had moved to stand behind her, though he remained carefully out of sight of the gathering crowd. "You don't have to speak with him," he said quietly. "Not if you're not ready." But Elenora had lived too long and weathered too many storms to hide from difficult conversations. She straightened her shoulders and moved toward the front door, pausing only to touch the moonstone pendant for courage. "Lady Elenora," Father Benedict began formally as she emerged onto the front steps. "Thank you for seeing me. I'm afraid there have been some disturbing reports about your household." "What sort of reports?" "Strange sightings, unnatural occurrences." His eyes flicked toward the house as if he expected to see something lurking in the shadows. "Mrs. Hartwell claims she saw your husband walking the graveyard at midnight, speaking to the stones as if the dead could hear him. Master Fletcher swears he saw the man moving through his fields without disturbing so much as a blade of grass, as if he weighed nothing at all. And young Tom Miller," Mrs. Hartwell added, pushing forward in her eagerness to contribute, "he says he saw the stranger standing in the full moonlight without casting any shadow at all." A murmur went through the crowd at this pronouncement. Elenora felt her heart racing, but she kept her expression calm. "People see many strange things when they're walking about in darkness," she said evenly. "Perhaps these witnesses should consider staying safely in their own homes after nightfall." Father Benedict stepped closer, lowering his voice, though his words were clearly meant to be overheard. "My lady, I've been a priest in this village for 20 years. I've learned to distinguish between imagination and genuine spiritual disturbance. Something is not right about your husband, and I fear for your safety. My safety is my own concern, Father, not when it affects the spiritual well-being of the entire community." His voice grew sharper, taking on the authoritative tone he used during sermons. "There are forces in this world that prey upon the faithful, that use our capacity for love and compassion as weapons against us. If your husband is what I suspect him to be—" "And what exactly do you suspect him to be?" Elenora interrupted, her own voice carrying a dangerous edge. The priest's pause was telling. She could see him weighing his words, considering how much of his suspicion to voice aloud. "Something that has no place among God-fearing Christians," he said finally. "Something that should be examined by those qualified to determine the truth." The pendant at her throat seemed to grow warmer, its light pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. Around her, the faces of her neighbors, people she had known for years, watched with a mixture of fear and fascination. She realized that this was the moment Aaron had been dreading, the point where suspicion hardened into accusation and compassion transformed into persecution. "I appreciate your concern, Father," she said with careful dignity, "but my husband is a good man who has brought nothing but kindness into my life. I will not have him judged by gossip and midnight imaginings." As she turned to go back inside, she heard Father Benedict call after her, "The church will be watching, Lady Elenora. For your sake, and for the sake of all souls in this village, we will be watching very closely." Inside the house, she found Aaron standing exactly where she had left him, his expression resigned. "It's beginning," he said quietly, "just as it always does." Elenora reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers despite the supernatural chill of his touch. The moonstone pendant pulsed with gentle light between them, a small beacon of hope in the gathering darkness of suspicion. "Then we'll face it together," she said firmly. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it as one." The blood-stained dagger lay hidden beneath Aaron's few possessions, like a secret carved from nightmare and memory. Elenora discovered it by accident, while tidying their shared chamber, her fingers brushing against the wrapped bundle tucked deep within his traveling pack. The cloth that concealed it was ancient silk, once white but now stained the color of old wine, and when she unwrapped it with trembling hands, the blade that emerged seemed to drink the afternoon light rather than reflect it. It was beautiful in the way that instruments of death could be beautiful, perfectly balanced, its steel etched with symbols that predated any script she recognized. The crossguard bore elaborate engravings of vines and roses, but it was the dark stains along the fuller that made her breath catch. Blood, old and set deep into the metal, that no amount of cleaning could ever fully remove. Her hands shook as she rewrapped the weapon, her mind struggling to reconcile this evidence of violence with the gentle man who had never raised his voice in anger, who moved through their home with the careful grace of someone afraid his very presence might cause harm. Yet as she held the dagger, she found herself thinking not of fear but of sorrow, for whatever circumstances had forced such a weapon into Aaron's hands, for whatever pain had driven him to use it. "You weren't meant to find that." His voice from the doorway made her startle, but she did not drop the wrapped bundle. When she turned to face him, she saw resignation in his grey eyes, as if he had always known this moment would come. "How long have you been standing there?" she asked quietly. "Long enough to see the fear in your hands as you held it." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. "Long enough to know that you deserve an explanation, even if giving one destroys everything we've built together." Elenora set the dagger carefully on the bed between them, its presence suddenly seeming to fill the entire room. "Tell me." Aaron moved to the window, his pale profile etched against the dying light of afternoon. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "That blade has tasted the blood of kings and commoners alike. It has ended lives both innocent and guilty, sometimes by my choice and sometimes by necessity. It is the instrument of my damnation and perhaps my only path to redemption. I don't understand." He turned from the window, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked truly ancient, not in appearance, for his face remained unmarked by age, but in the depth of weariness that seemed to emanate from his very soul. "I am not what you think me to be, Elenora. I am not even what I appear to be. I am something that should not exist, something that most of humanity would destroy without question or mercy." The moonstone pendant at her throat pulsed with warm light, as if responding to the tension in the room. She touched it unconsciously, drawing comfort from its familiar weight. "Then tell me what you are." "I am cursed," he said simply. "Cursed to walk this earth for longer than any mortal should, to watch everyone I care for grow old and die while I remain unchanged. I am neither fully alive nor truly dead, sustained by things that would horrify you if you knew their nature." Elenora felt her heart racing, but not with fear. With understanding. All the small mysteries, his nocturnal habits, his lack of reflection, the way religious artifacts affected him suddenly aligned into a picture that was both terrifying and heartbreaking. "You're a vampire," she said quietly. The word hung between them like a blade. Aaron's expression cycled through surprise, pain, and something that might have been relief. "You speak the word without fleeing in terror." I confess I had not expected such composure. How long have I been this way? 7 centuries, give or take a decade. Long enough to learn that existence without purpose is merely elaborate suffering. Long enough to understand why so many of my kind eventually choose to greet the sunrise without protection. 7 centuries. The number staggered her, made her own 54 years seem like a brief flicker of candlelight against an endless night. Yet as she looked at him, this man who had brought such unexpected joy into her twilight years, she found herself thinking not of the monster he claimed to be, but of the profound loneliness such an existence must entail. "And the dagger?" His hands clenched at his sides. "A tool of my former life. When I was newly mad with hunger and rage, I killed without discrimination or mercy. That blade drank deeply from both the guilty and the innocent, until the weight of what I had become finally penetrated the bloodlust that drove me. What changed? A child." The words came out broken, barely above a whisper. "A little girl, no more than 6 years old, who showed me kindness even as her parents lay dead by my hand. She offered me her only possession, a crust of bread, because she thought I looked hungry." Elenora felt tears burning her eyes as she imagined the scene, a monster confronted by innocence, evil redeemed by the generosity of a child. "I could not bring myself to harm her," Aaron continued. "For the first time since my transformation, I felt something other than rage and hunger. I felt shame. I felt the weight of what I had become and what I had done. What happened to her? I took her to safety, to a convent where she would be cared for. but not before she changed everything I thought I knew about my nature. That night, I swore an oath that I would never again feed upon human blood, never again take a life in service of my own survival. Is that possible? Can a vampire survive without? Not easily. Not without constant pain and the gradual erosion of the powers that define my kind. But it is possible, if one has sufficient motivation. His grey eyes found hers across the room. I have been slowly dying for 7 centuries, choosing starvation over murder, weakness over strength. Until I met you, I thought it was a fair trade. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Elenora understood now why he had been so reluctant to accept her offer of marriage, why he had warned her repeatedly that there were things about him she wouldn't understand. And now I find myself wanting to live again, truly live, for the first time in centuries. You have given me something I thought lost forever, a reason to continue existing that goes beyond mere survival or penance. Before she could respond, the sound of horses approaching at speed interrupted their conversation. Through the window, they could see a group of riders approaching the manor, their leader wearing the distinctive black robes of a church official. But this was not Father Benedict. This man carried himself with an authority that spoke of higher rank and more dangerous purpose. "Vampire hunters," Aaron said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. "I had hoped we would have more time." Elenora moved to stand beside him at the window, her hand finding his despite the supernatural chill of his skin. "How do you know?" "Because I recognize their leader, Brother Marcus of the Holy Inquisition, a man who has dedicated his life to hunting and destroying creatures like me. Someone must have sent word to the church, authorities about the strange happenings in our village." The riders had reached the courtyard now, and Elenora could see the grim determination in their faces. These were not simple villagers driven by gossip and fear. These were trained professionals who had come to investigate reports of supernatural activity. "What do we do?" Aaron's hand tightened on hers, and for a moment she felt the full weight of his supernatural strength carefully controlled. "We face whatever comes with dignity," he said quietly, "and we pray that love truly can conquer even the deepest darkness." The ancient mirror frame stood empty in the corner of their chamber, its ornate silver borders tarnished black with age. Elenora had noticed it on their wedding night, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship that should have held glass, but instead framed only shadows and emptiness. She had assumed the mirror had been broken and removed, but now, understanding what Aaron truly was, she realized the frame's emptiness held far deeper significance. "It once held the finest Venetian glass," Aaron said quietly, following her gaze to the empty frame. His voice carried the weight of loss, as if the missing mirror represented far more than simple vanity. "I commissioned it 3 centuries ago, back when I still hoped I might somehow reclaim my reflection, my humanity." Elenora approached the frame slowly, running her fingers along its intricate engravings. The silver was real, she could tell, and the workmanship spoke of master craftsmen who had poured their souls into creating something beautiful. Yet, without its glass, it served only as a reminder of what was absent. "What happened to the mirror?" "I destroyed it." The admission came quietly, heavy with old pain. "On a night when the weight of what I had become grew too heavy to bear, I stood before it, searching for any trace of the man I had once been, and found only emptiness staring back. In my rage, I shattered it with my bare hands, cutting myself so deeply that the wounds took days to heal." She turned to face him, seeing the memory play across his features, like shadows cast by candlelight. "You were searching for your soul. I was searching for proof that I still possessed one. Yes, the church teaches that vampires are soulless creatures, damned beyond redemption. For centuries, I believed this to be true. I thought myself nothing more than an animated corpse, a mockery of the man I had once been. And now," Aaron moved to stand beside her, both of them reflected in the frame's emptiness, or rather, she was reflected while he remained invisible, a gap in the world beside her image. Now, I am no longer certain what I believe. These months with you have awakened feelings I thought dead forever. If I am truly soulless, how can I feel such profound love? If I am damned beyond redemption, how can your presence bring me such peace? The honesty in his voice broke her heart. She reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers despite the supernatural chill that always marked his touch. "Tell me about your life before," she said softly. "Before the curse. Who were you when you cast a reflection?" For a long moment, she thought he would retreat into the careful silence that usually greeted questions about his past. Then, slowly, he began to speak. "I was Aaron Blackthorne, youngest son of a minor lord in what is now the northern reaches of England. I was 28 when I was turned young enough to still believe in honor and justice, old enough to have learned that the world rarely rewards such beliefs." He paused, his eyes growing distant with memory. "I was a knight in service to King Edward, though not a particularly distinguished one. I fought adequately, rode reasonably well, and possessed just enough skill with a sword to avoid embarrassing myself in tournament. My greatest weakness was my compassion. I had difficulty understanding why nobles should live in luxury, while peasants starved, why might should automatically triumph over right. That doesn't sound like a weakness to me. It was what led to my transformation. I discovered that my liege lord was selling grain meant for his starving tenants to foreign merchants for profit. When I confronted him, he arranged for me to be attacked on a lonely stretch of road. My attackers left me for dead, but death was not what found me in that ditch." Elenora felt her breath catch. "What found you?" "An ancient vampire named Valdris, drawn by the scent of my blood. He was old even then, changed sometime during the reign of the first Roman emperors. Instead of simply feeding and leaving my corpse for the crows, he chose to transform me, whether from loneliness or some twisted sense of humor, I never learned." "Where is he now?" "Dead by my own hand," Aaron replied without emotion. "When I finally gained enough strength and skill to challenge him, I made sure he would never create another cursed soul." The weight of that admission settled between them. Elenora found herself thinking of the blood-stained dagger hidden in his belongings, understanding now at least one life it had claimed. "Do you regret it? Killing him? Every day. Not because he deserved mercy, he had murdered hundreds, perhaps thousands over the centuries, but because in taking his life, I became exactly the kind of monster I had sworn never to be again. You were protecting others. I was seeking revenge. There is a difference, though I have spent decades trying to convince myself otherwise." A sound from the courtyard below interrupted their conversation, the clatter of hooves on stone, followed by authoritative voices issuing commands. Through their window, they could see Brother Marcus directing his men in what appeared to be a systematic search of the manor grounds. "They're looking for evidence," Aaron observed quietly. "Signs of supernatural activity, unholy artifacts, anything they can use to justify what they've already decided to do, which is destroy me, and quite possibly you as well. The Inquisition does not distinguish between willing and unwilling participants when it comes to consorting with the damned." Elenora felt a chill that had nothing to do with her husband's supernatural nature. She had heard whispers of the Inquisition's methods, their willingness to torture confessions from the innocent and burn entire families for the crime of association with suspected heretics. "We could flee," she said quietly. "Leave tonight, before they have time to build their case against us. And where would we go? I have been running for 7 centuries, Elenora. Every time I find a place of peace, every time I dare to hope for something approaching a normal existence, the hunters find me. I am tired of running. Then we fight. The simple statement seemed to surprise him. He turned to stare at her with an expression of wonder and pain combined. "My dear lady, you do not understand what you are suggesting. These are not village gossips or concerned family members. These are professional hunters trained in the identification and destruction of supernatural threats. They have weapons blessed by the Pope himself, knowledge passed down through generations of vampire killers. Against such enemies, I am merely a starving shadow of what I once was. Then maybe it's time to stop starving." The words escaped before she could consider their implications, but once spoken, she realized she meant them completely. If her husband was indeed a creature that required blood to maintain his strength, and if enemies had arrived who meant to destroy them both, then perhaps his noble starvation had become a luxury they could no longer afford. Aaron stared at her in shock. "You cannot mean, I mean that I will not watch you die because you've chosen honor over survival. I mean that if there is a way for you to regain your strength, your powers, then you should consider it. I will not break my oath. I will not become the monster I once was." "Then don't break it," she said firmly, "but find another way. You said yourself that you've been slowly dying for centuries. Maybe it's time to start living again." Outside, Brother Marcus's voice could be heard giving orders to search every room, every cellar, every possible hiding place. The hunt for evidence was beginning in earnest. Aaron looked once more at the empty mirror frame, then at Elenora standing beside him, her reflection alone and defiant in the silver borders. "If we are to survive what comes next," he said quietly, "you will need to understand exactly what I am capable of becoming. The powers I have let fade through disuse, the abilities that made me a terror to both the living and the dead. Show me," she whispered. And in the growing darkness of their chamber, with the Inquisition gathering strength in the courtyard below, Aaron Blackthorn began to remember what it meant to be truly dangerous. The royal seal ring lay hidden in a secret compartment of Aaron's leather pack, concealed beneath a false bottom that Elenora discovered only by accident when the leather cracked along an old seam. As her fingers traced the compartment's edges, she felt the cool weight of metal and pulled forth a signet ring that made her breath catch in her throat. The ring was magnificent, heavy gold, set with a deep sapphire, around which was carved the unmistakable heraldry of ancient royalty. Lions rampant flanked a crowned tree, beneath which was inscribed a motto in Latin that she recognized, despite her limited education: Virtus et honor. Virtue and honor. But it was the name etched in flowing script around the band's interior that made her hands tremble. Aaron Rex Valdoria. King Aaron of Valdoria. "You were not simply a knight," she whispered to the empty chamber, her voice barely audible over the sound of Brother Marcus's men continuing their search of the grounds below. "You were a king." The implications crashed over her like a tide. Everything Aaron had told her about his past, the minor lord's son, the undistinguished knight, the man who fought adequately but without great skill, had been carefully crafted lies designed to hide a truth far more dangerous than vampire nature alone. When Aaron returned from his evening walk, he found her sitting on their bed with the ring resting in her open palm like an accusation made solid. The transformation that came over his features was immediate and profound. Gone was the careful humility, the deferential manner of a man accustomed to hiding in shadows. For just a moment, she saw him as he truly was, 7 centuries of command, authority, and royal bearing that no amount of self-imposed exile could completely erase. "Where did you find that?" His voice carried undertones of power that she had never heard before, ancient authority that made the very air in the room feel heavier. "Does it matter? What matters is that you've been lying to me from the moment we met." Despite her hurt, she kept her voice steady. "You're not just any vampire, are you? You're royalty. A king." Aaron moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back, in a gesture she now recognized as belonging to someone born to rule. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. I was king of Valdoria for 6 years, 2 months and 14 days. I was crowned at 22 and transformed at 28. My kingdom fell 3 months after my disappearance, conquered by neighboring lords who sensed weakness in my absence. Why didn't you tell me? He turned from the window, and she saw pain etched deep in his features. Because kings are never allowed to simply disappear. There are always those who remember, always those who seek to use royal blood for their own purposes. I learned long ago that Aaron, the displaced knight, could find peace in ways that Aaron Rex never could. What happened to your kingdom? Your people? Scattered to the winds. Some fled to other realms, some were absorbed into the territories of my enemies. A few loyal houses maintained the bloodline, passing down stories and treasures in hopes that their king might someday return to reclaim his throne. The moonstone pendant at Eleonora's throat pulsed with warm light, as if responding to the revelation. She thought of Aaron's careful manners, his instinctive understanding of noble protocol, the way he had deferred to her family despite their obvious inferior breeding. The pendant, she said suddenly. It belonged to your queen, didn't it? Her name was Lyanna of House Morwen. We were betrothed from childhood, married for love, despite the political convenience of the match. She was everything a queen should be: intelligent, compassionate, beloved by our people. You said she died because of what you are. Aaron's expression grew distant, lost in memories that clearly brought him nothing but pain. When I disappeared after my transformation, she refused to accept that I was dead. She spent months searching for me, following every rumor and report. When she finally found me, his voice broke, and Elenora felt her heart clench with sympathy for a pain that had endured 7 centuries without healing. I was not yet in control of what I had become. The hunger, the rage, the supernatural strength. I was more monster than man. When she approached me, speaking my name with such love and hope, I nearly killed her before I recognized who she was. But you didn't. No. Some fragment of the man I had been remained strong enough to stop me, but the damage was done. She had seen what I had become, understood that the husband and king she loved was gone forever. I fled that night, thinking to protect her by staying away. What happened to her? She gathered our most trusted knights and rode out in pursuit, determined to bring me home despite what I had become. They were set upon by bandits 2 days into their journey. Lyanna and her entire party were slaughtered. The raw anguish in his voice made Eleonora's eyes fill with tears. She understood now why he had been so reluctant to accept her love, so afraid of bringing danger into her life. His past was littered with people who had died because they cared for him. Before she could offer comfort, the sound of splintering wood echoed from somewhere below them. Brother Marcus had apparently grown tired of polite searching and had begun breaking down doors. "They're inside the house," Aaron said quietly, his royal composure reasserting itself even in the face of immediate danger. "What do they want?" "Evidence. Proof that they can present to higher authorities to justify their actions. But I suspect they've already found something that interests them far more than simple vampire hunting." "What do you mean?" Aaron moved to their wardrobe and began pulling out traveling clothes with swift efficiency. "Your family's investigation into my background. When they found no records of my existence, they likely shared their concerns with church authorities. Brother Marcus isn't here because he suspects I'm a vampire. He's here because someone has whispered that I might be connected to the lost royal line of Valdoria." The pieces began falling into place with terrifying clarity. They know who you are. They suspect. And if they can prove it, my mere existence becomes a threat to the current political order. Kings, even exiled and cursed ones, have a tendency to inspire loyalty among those who remember the old ways. I represent a claim to a crown that others now wear. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside their chamber, accompanied by the clink of mail and weapons. Brother Marcus's voice could be heard giving orders to his men, directing them to search every room thoroughly. "There's more," Aaron continued grimly. "If I am indeed the lost king, then my marriage to you has political implications that extend far beyond personal choice. You are now, technically, a queen, with all the protections and dangers that such a title entails." Elenora felt the world tilt around her. Queen. The word seemed impossibly large, fraught with responsibilities and perils she could never have imagined. "Your children," Aaron continued, his voice growing urgent as the footsteps drew closer, "they will have heard rumors by now. If they believe that marriage to me might elevate their own status, might grant them access to lost royal treasures or political connections, they would use that information," she finished, understanding flooding through her. "They would try to profit from it, regardless of the danger to both of us." A sharp knock on their door interrupted the conversation. Brother Marcus's voice called through the heavy wood. "Lord Aaron, Lady Elenora, by the authority of the Holy Church, we require your immediate presence for questioning." Elenora looked at her husband, her king, and saw 7 centuries of survival instinct warring with the bone-deep weariness of someone who had run from his true identity for far too long. "What do we do?" she whispered. Aaron straightened, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked every inch the royal authority he had been born to be. When he spoke, his voice carried the command of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We stop running. We stop hiding. If Brother Marcus wishes to face a king, then by God he shall have one." He slipped the royal signet ring onto his finger, where it settled as if it had never been removed. The transformation was immediate and profound. Gone was the humble wanderer, replaced by something far more dangerous and infinitely more regal. "But first," he said, moving toward the hidden dagger, "we make sure we survive long enough to reclaim what was stolen from us." The knock came again, harder and more insistent. Time had run out for secrets and gentle revelations. Whatever came next would determine not only their survival, but the fate of a kingdom lost 7 centuries ago, and the people who still remembered its rightful king. The holy water vial gleamed like liquid starlight in Brother Marcus's weathered hands, its crystal surface etched with prayers in languages that predated the village of Ravensmoor itself. As the Inquisitor held it aloft in their chamber, the blessed water within seemed to pulse with its own inner radiance, casting dancing shadows on the walls that moved with unnatural purpose. "This water was blessed by His Holiness himself," Brother Marcus announced, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "It has touched the lips of saints and been sanctified in the holiest places of Christendom. No creature of darkness can endure its purifying touch." Aaron stood motionless in the center of the room, his royal signet ring catching the candlelight as his hands remained steady at his sides. He had donned the bearing of his kingship like armor, every line of his posture speaking to 7 centuries of command, despite the supernatural hunger that weakened him. Behind him, Elenora clutched the moonstone pendant, drawing what courage she could from its warm pulse against her palm. "You wish to test my nature," Aaron said quietly, his voice carrying undertones of power that made the armed men behind Brother Marcus shift nervously. "Very well, but know that you test more than simple flesh and blood. You test the soul of a king who has spent centuries seeking redemption for sins that haunt him still." Brother Marcus stepped forward, his dark eyes glittering with zealous certainty. "Pretty words, Your Majesty, if indeed that title holds any meaning for one such as you. But the Church has ways of revealing truth that no amount of royal bearing can disguise." He uncorked the vial with deliberate ceremony, the blessed water within beginning to glow more brightly as exposure to air activated whatever sacred properties it possessed. Several of his men muttered prayers under their breath, their hands moving to weapons blessed by priests and forged specifically for supernatural combat. "This is what separates the righteous from the damned," Brother Marcus continued, raising the vial toward Aaron. "Holy water burns the flesh of vampires like acid, causes them to writhe in agony as their unholy forms reject divine sanctification. If you are truly the monster I suspect you to be, this will prove it beyond question." "And if I am not?" Elenora asked, stepping forward despite Aaron's subtle gesture for her to remain back. "What then, Brother Marcus? What penalty does the Church pay for torturing an innocent man based on village gossip and political suspicion?" The Inquisitor's smile was cold as winter stone. "The Church answers only to God, Lady Elenora, but I suspect we will not need to concern ourselves with such questions." He tilted. The vial, allowing a single drop of the blessed water to fall toward Aaron's outstretched hand. Elenora held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs as the droplet caught the candlelight during its descent. The holy water struck Aaron's palm with a sound like rain on hot stone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, steam began to rise from the point of contact, carrying with it the scent of something burning. Aaron's jaw tightened, the only sign of discomfort he allowed himself, but he did not cry out or pull his hand away. "Interesting," Brother Marcus murmured, leaning closer to examine the effect. "Pain, certainly, but not the immediate destruction one would expect from a creature wholly given over to darkness." He poured more water onto Aaron's palm, watching with scientific fascination as the blessed liquid hissed and steamed against supernatural flesh. This time, Aaron did flinch, his breath escaping in a controlled hiss, but still he held his ground. "You see," he said through gritted teeth, his voice strained but steady. "I am not immune to divine judgment, but neither am I consumed by it. Perhaps there are more categories of existence than your texts account for, Brother Marcus. Perhaps redemption is possible even for the damned." Elenora stepped closer, ignoring the warning looks from the armed men. She could see the angry red marks where the holy water had burned her husband's flesh, but she could also see something else. The wounds were already beginning to heal, not with the rapid regeneration of a healthy vampire, but slowly, as if his body were fighting to repair damage while lacking the strength to do so efficiently. "He's starving," she said suddenly, understanding flooding through her. "That's why he can endure the holy water. He's been denying his nature for so long that it's slowly killing him. He's more human now than monster." Brother Marcus turned his cold gaze upon her. "Starvation does not absolve sin, my lady. It merely weakens the vessel. The corruption remains." "Does it?" Elenora challenged, her voice growing stronger as her conviction solidified. "If a vampire can choose to starve rather than kill, if he can endure centuries of suffering rather than take innocent life, what does that say about the state of his soul?" Before Brother Marcus could respond, commotion erupted in the courtyard below. Through their window they could see riders approaching at speed, nobles bearing familiar banners that made Eleonora's heart sink. Her children had arrived, and they had not come alone. "Ah," Brother Marcus smiled with satisfaction. "Your family brings reinforcements and perhaps more interesting intelligence about your husband's true identity." As if summoned by his words, Marcus the Younger burst into the chamber without ceremony, his face flushed with excitement and avarice. Behind him came Catherine and Thomas, along with several men. Elenora didn't recognize mercenaries. By their look, hired swords, with the cold eyes of men accustomed to violence. "Brother Marcus," her eldest son said breathlessly, "we've uncovered information that changes everything. This man isn't simply a vagrant vampire, he's the lost king of Valdoria. Do you understand what this means?" "I understand that it makes him infinitely more dangerous," the Inquisitor replied coolly. "Royal blood has a way of inspiring loyalty even in death. But also more valuable," Catherine added, her voice sharp with greed. "A vampire king could be used, controlled, made to serve the Church's interests." Think of the political advantages, the fear he could inspire in enemies of the faith. Elenora felt sick hearing her daughter speak of Aaron as if he were a weapon to be wielded rather than a person to be protected. "Catherine, how can I be practical?" her daughter interrupted. "Mother, you've stumbled into something far larger than a simple marriage of convenience. If this man truly is King Aaron of Valdoria, then his return could destabilize half a dozen current political arrangements. The church, the nobles who gained from Valdoria's fall, even foreign kingdoms, they all have interests in seeing him either controlled or destroyed." Thomas stepped forward, his young face troubled but determined. "There's more, Mother. We've discovered that several old noble houses have been watching for signs of the lost king's return. They've maintained bloodline records, hidden treasures, even small armies of loyal retainers. If word spreads that King Aaron lives, there will be war," Brother Marcus finished grimly. "Rebellions, succession crises, the kind of chaos that tears kingdoms apart. The church cannot allow such disruption to the divine order." Aaron had remained silent during this exchange, but now he stepped forward, his bearing regal despite the holy water burns marking his flesh. "And what if the lost king has no interest in reclaiming his throne? What if 7 centuries of exile have taught him that power corrupts even the most well-intentioned ruler?" "Do you renounce your claim?" Brother Marcus asked sharply. "Will you swear before God and these witnesses that you have no desire to reclaim the crown of Valdoria?" The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility and danger. Elenora could see the weight of decision pressing down on Aaron's shoulders, centuries of guilt and loss, warring with whatever dreams of justice and restoration might still flicker in his ancient heart. "I renounce nothing," he said finally, his voice carrying the full authority of his bloodline. "But neither do I claim anything. I am a man seeking only to live in peace with the woman I love. If others choose to see threat or opportunity in my existence, that burden lies with them, not with me." "Unacceptable," Brother Marcus declared. "The church requires certainty, not philosophical ambiguity. You will either submit to our authority and accept whatever judgment we deem appropriate, or you will be destroyed as a threat to the natural order." "There is a third option," Elenora said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. All eyes turned to her as she stepped closer to her husband, her hand finding his despite the supernatural chill of his touch. "Speak," Brother Marcus commanded. "Trial by ordeal," she said clearly. "Let God himself judge whether Aaron Blackthorn, King of Valdoria, deserves condemnation or redemption. Let divine will, not human prejudice, determine his fate." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Trial by ordeal was an ancient practice, rarely used in modern times, but still recognized by church law. It would place Aaron's fate directly in God's hands, removing human judgment from the equation. Brother Marcus studied her with newfound respect and suspicion. "You would risk your husband's destruction on divine whim?" "I would trust in divine justice," she replied firmly, "as should any true servant of the church." The inquisitor's cold smile suggested he saw opportunity in her proposal. "Very well. At dawn, we shall construct a trial that will test not only this creature's supernatural nature, but his worthiness to bear the crown he claims to renounce. If God judges him worthy of redemption, we will know by his survival. If not," he left the threat unfinished. But its implications hung heavy in the air. As the various parties began to withdraw to prepare for dawn's trial, Elenora remained close to Aaron, drawing comfort from his presence, even as she wondered if she had just sealed both their fates. "Are you prepared for what comes next?" she whispered. Aaron's grey eyes met hers, and for the first time in days, she saw something like hope flickering in their depths. "With you beside me, my queen, I am prepared for anything." Outside, the first pale hints of dawn were beginning to touch the eastern horizon. The burning torch cast dancing shadows across the faces of the assembled crowd as dawn broke over Raven's Moor, its flames seeming to reach toward the pale sky like grasping fingers of judgment. Brother Marcus held the brand aloft with ceremonial solemnity, its fire blessed with holy oils and sanctified prayers that made the very air around it shimmer with supernatural heat. "Behold the flame of divine justice," the Inquisitor proclaimed to the gathered witnesses. "Let no man say that God's will has not been clearly displayed before all who have eyes to see." The village square had been transformed into an arena of judgment. At its center stood a wooden platform, hastily constructed during the night hours, surrounded by circles of onlookers whose faces reflected the torchlight, with expressions ranging from terrified fascination to cruel anticipation. Eleonora's children stood with Brother Marcus's men, their positions making clear which side of this conflict had claimed their loyalty. Aaron knelt at the platform's center, his hands bound with chains that had been blessed by 3 different priests and inscribed with scripture in languages both ancient and modern. Despite his restraints, despite the holy water burns still marking his flesh, he maintained the dignified bearing of a king facing judgment with courage intact. "The trial is simple," Brother Marcus announced, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "The accused will be tested by flame, by silver, and by the direct word of God. Should he survive all 3 ordeals without succumbing to his supposed vampiric nature, the Church will acknowledge that divine mercy has intervened on his behalf." Elenora stood as close to the platform as the guards would allow, the moonstone pendant warm against her throat as if drawing strength from her determination. She had fought for the right to witness every moment of the trial, knowing that whatever happened next would determine not only Aaron's fate, but the future of their impossible love. "First," Brother Marcus continued, approaching with the burning torch, "the test of purification. Let holy fire reveal the truth of what stands before us." He lowered the torch toward Aaron's bound hands, the blessed flames licking at supernatural flesh with hunger that seemed almost alive. The crowd held its collective breath as fire met skin, waiting for the screams of a creature in torment or the silence of something already beyond mortal pain. What they witnessed was neither. Aaron's jaw clenched as the flames touched him, his breathing becoming controlled and deliberate, but he did not cry out. More remarkably, though the fire clearly caused him pain, it did not consume him as it should have consumed any creature of pure darkness. Instead, the flames seemed to dance around his flesh, burning without destroying, purifying rather than destroying. "Impossible," whispered one of Brother Marcus's men. "The blessed fire should reduce a vampire to ash within moments. Unless—" "Elenora," called out, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet square, "he is more than what you believe him to be. Unless 7 centuries of choosing mercy over hunger, love over hatred, has transformed his very nature." Brother Marcus withdrew the torch, studying the burns on Aaron's hands with scientific fascination. Like the holy water before it, the blessed fire had caused pain without bringing destruction. "The second test," the Inquisitor announced, producing a silver blade from his robes. The weapon gleamed with more than natural brightness, its edge inscribed with prayers and blessed by papal authority. "Let silver truth cut away all deception." He pressed the flat of the blade against Aaron's throat, where it should have seared supernatural flesh like molten metal. Instead, though Aaron winced at the contact, the silver produced only the kind of burn any human might receive from heated metal, painful but not supernaturally destructive. "What manner of creature are you?" Brother Marcus demanded, his certainty beginning to crack in the face of evidence that defied everything he had been taught about vampire nature. Aaron raised his head to meet the Inquisitor's gaze, his grey eyes reflecting depths of experience that stretched back centuries. "I am what I have chosen to become, Brother Marcus. I am proof that even the damned may seek redemption, that even monsters may find grace." Blasphemy, one of the watching priests declared. The church teaches that vampires are soulless abominations, incapable of salvation. Then perhaps, Elenora said, stepping forward despite the guard's attempts to restrain her, the church's teachings are incomplete. Perhaps God's mercy extends further than human understanding can grasp. The crowd stirred uneasily at this challenge to religious authority. Several villagers who had known Elenora for years looked confused and troubled, caught between their trust in church doctrine and the evidence of their own eyes. Marcus the Younger pushed forward from among Brother Marcus's supporters, his face flushed with anger and something that looked like desperation. "Mother, stop this madness. Can't you see what's happening? Your husband is deceiving everyone with some sort of dark magic. He's making himself appear human when he's nothing but a monster." "Is he?" Elenora challenged, her voice growing stronger as conviction filled her. "Or have you simply never seen what true redemption looks like? Have you become so accustomed to judging by appearances that you cannot recognize genuine transformation when it stands before you?" Brother Marcus raised his hand for silence, his dark eyes fixed on Aaron with intense concentration. "There remains one final test," he announced, "the most important of all." He produced a leather-bound book from his robes, not a Bible, but something older, its pages yellowed with age, and its binding marked with symbols that predated Christian tradition. "The Litany of True Names," he explained, opening the book to pages covered in dense script, ancient words that compel supernatural creatures to reveal their fundamental nature. No vampire, regardless of how cleverly it may disguise itself, can resist the power of these invocations. As he began to read, his voice taking on the rhythm of formal incantation, the air around the platform seemed to thicken and grow heavy. The words he spoke were in a language that predated Latin, syllables that seemed to resonate with power drawn from the very foundations of creation. Aaron's body went rigid as the incantation washed over him, his face contorting as if he were fighting against invisible chains. For the first time since the trial began, he appeared to be in genuine distress, his carefully maintained composure cracking under the assault of ancient compulsion. "Now we shall see," Brother Marcus declared, his voice rising above the mystical words, "exactly what stands before us in the guise of a man." The crown of thorns carving lay at Aaron's feet where it had fallen from his bound hands, its wooden surface worn smooth by countless hours of careful craftsmanship. He had carved it during the long nights of their marriage, Elenora realized, working by candlelight while she slept, pouring his centuries of anguish and hope into the simple piece of wood. The thorns were delicate, realistic, each one shaped with the precision of someone who understood suffering intimately. As the ancient words of compulsion washed over him, Aaron's body convulsed against his blessed chains, but his eyes never left the wooden carving. When he spoke, his voice cut through Brother Marcus's incantations like a blade through silk. "I am Aaron Blackthorn," he declared, each word forced out against supernatural pressure that would have destroyed a weaker will. "I am a creature cursed with immortal hunger who chose to starve rather than kill. I am a king who abdicated his throne to protect his people from what he had become. I am a monster who learned to love mercy more than power." The litany of true names faltered as Brother Marcus stared in amazement. The ancient words were supposed to strip away all pretense, to reveal the fundamental nature of supernatural beings without possibility of deception. Yet Aaron continued to speak of his own volition, his truth more complex than the simple categories the ritual was designed to expose. "I am a vampire," Aaron continued, his voice growing stronger rather than weaker under the magical assault, "who has spent 7 centuries learning what it means to be human. I am proof that redemption is possible even for the damned, that love can transform even the most cursed soul." Father Benedict, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward from the crowd. "This is impossible," he declared, his voice shaking with theological confusion. The Church teaches that vampires are soulless creatures, incapable of genuine repentance. What we're witnessing contradicts everything. Everything we thought we knew. Elenora interrupted, moving closer to the platform despite the guards' protests. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps God's grace extends further than human doctrine imagines. Brother Marcus slammed the ancient book shut, his face flushed with anger and bewilderment. Enough! I will not have centuries of church teaching undermined by some clever deception. This creature may have learned to resist our tests through dark arts, but Brother Marcus, the voice that cut through his protests carried such quiet authority that every person in the square fell silent. It had come from Aaron, but the man who spoke now bore little resemblance to the humble wanderer who had first appeared in Ravensmoor. This was a king addressing subjects, a ruler claiming his birthright through will alone rather than force. "You speak of dark arts," Aaron continued, somehow rising to his feet despite the blessed chains that should have held him immobile. "But what art is darker than choosing love over vengeance? What magic is more powerful than preferring sacrifice to selfishness?" He gestured toward the crown of thorns, carving with his bound hands. "I made this to remind myself daily of the price of redemption. Every thorn represents a life I took in my early years as a monster, every curve a soul I failed to save. It is my penance made manifest, my promise to be better than what I was created to be." "Pretty words." Marcus the Younger shouted from the crowd, "But you're still an abomination, whatever philosophy you've wrapped around your true nature." "Am I?" Aaron turned his ancient gaze upon his stepson, and for a moment the young man stepped back as if physically struck by the weight of those eyes. "Then tell me, Marcus, in all the months I have lived under your mother's roof, what evil have you witnessed? What harm have I brought to her or to anyone else in this village?" The silence that followed was telling. Elenora could see the confusion spreading through the crowd as they realized that despite all their fears and suspicions, no actual crimes could be laid at Aaron's feet. "He's right, old missus," Hartwell called out suddenly, her voice trembling but determined. "For all my watching and worrying, I've seen nothing but kindness from the man. He helped young Tom Miller repair his roof after the storms, asked for nothing in return. And he sat with my dying father," added Sarah Miller, stepping forward from the crowd. "Held vigil through the night when none of us could bear to watch any more. Spoke words of comfort that eased his passing." More voices joined the chorus, as villagers who had been suspicious and fearful began to remember acts of quiet compassion they had witnessed but dismissed. The man they had feared as a monster had been living among them as a neighbor, offering help without fanfare and comfort without reward. Brother Marcus looked around desperately as his support began to crumble. "You are all bewitched. This creature has used dark magic to cloud your memories, to make you forget, to make us forget our prejudices," Elenora said firmly, stepping onto the platform beside her husband. "To see past our fears and recognize goodness where we expected to find evil." She knelt to retrieve the crown of thorns carving, holding it up so all could see the intricate craftsmanship, the countless hours of meditation and repentance it represented. "This is what redemption looks like," she declared, her voice carrying across the silent square. "Not a magical transformation that erases the past, but a daily choice to be better than what we were. To serve love instead of hunger, mercy instead of justice." The blessed chains that had bound Aaron began to glow with warm light, their metal growing hot, not with punishment, but with something that looked remarkably like benediction. As they watched in amazement, the chains simply fell away, their blessed steel no longer able to hold someone who had proven himself worthy of divine mercy. Brother Marcus stared in shock as his carefully constructed trial collapsed around him. "This cannot be God's will," he whispered. "Cannot it?" Father Benedict asked quietly, his own faith clearly shaken by what he had witnessed. "Perhaps we have been too quick to assume we understand the limits of divine forgiveness. Aaron stood free on the platform, the crown of thorns carving cradled in his hands like a prayer made solid. When he looked out at the crowd, his ancient eyes held neither triumph nor vindication, only a deep gratitude for the chance to be seen, finally, as what he truly was. The new chapel bell rang out across Ravensmoor for the first time in decades, its clear bronze voice carrying hope through the morning air like a prayer given wings. Unlike the cracked bell that had stood silent for so long, this one sang with perfect clarity, commissioned by the village as a gift for the couple who had taught them that redemption could take the most unexpected forms. 6 months had passed since the trial by ordeal that had changed everything. 6 months since Brother Marcus had departed in confused defeat, his theological certainties shattered by evidence of divine mercy that exceeded human understanding. The Inquisitor had left with his men but without his conviction, carrying with him questions that would trouble his sleep for years to come. Elenora stood beside her husband in their garden, watching the villagers gather for the bell's blessing ceremony. The change in their neighbors had been gradual but profound. Fear had given way to cautious respect, suspicion to genuine affection. Aaron's patient kindness and quiet wisdom had slowly won hearts that had once been closed against him. "Do you hear that?" she asked, tilting her head toward the bell's song. "It sounds like joy." Aaron smiled, his grey eyes holding warmth that had been absent during those first difficult months. "It sounds like home," he replied, his voice carrying wonder as if the concept still surprised him. The transformation in him had been as remarkable as the village's change of heart. Though he remained a vampire in nature, his daily choice to serve love over hunger had continued the slow restoration of his humanity. He could now touch blessed objects without pain, walk in daylight without discomfort, and look upon his reflection in mirrors faint and wavering still, but present, proof that his soul had not been entirely lost to darkness. "Mother Aaron," Thomas's voice called from the garden gate, his tone warm with genuine affection. Of all her children, he had been the first to truly accept Aaron, perhaps because his youth made him more willing to see beyond surface appearances to character beneath. Behind Thomas came Catherine and Marcus, their expressions still somewhat stiff, but no longer openly hostile. The revelation of Aaron's royal bloodline had complicated their feelings toward him, mixing their natural suspicion with a pragmatic recognition that having a king in the family, even an exiled vampire king, carried certain advantages. "The blessing ceremony is about to begin," Catherine announced, her voice carefully neutral. "Father Benedict asked us to escort you both to the chapel." Father Benedict had undergone his own transformation since the trial. The priest, who had once supported Brother Marcus's investigation, now spoke thoughtfully about the mysteries of divine grace and the dangers of limiting God's mercy to human understanding. His sermons had grown richer, more complex, acknowledging that the spiritual world contained wonders that transcended simple doctrinal categories. As they walked toward the chapel, Elenora noticed how the villagers greeted them. Mrs. Hartwell waved cheerfully from her garden, no longer whispering about midnight apparitions. Master Cooper called out a friendly greeting, his suspicions replaced by gratitude for Aaron's help rebuilding his workshop after a fire. Children ran up to show Aaron their small treasures, carved toys, pretty stones, wild flowers, knowing he would examine each gift with the serious attention it deserved. "Your Majesty," "Old Willem," the blacksmith said with a respectful nod as they passed his forge, "the horseshoes you designed are working perfectly. Never seen anything like them for keeping horses sure-footed on wet stone." Aaron inclined his head graciously. "I'm pleased they serve you well, Master Willem. 7 centuries provide ample time to observe what works and what doesn't." The casual mention of his age no longer caused the discomfort it once had. The village had gradually accepted that their newest resident possessed knowledge and experience far beyond his apparent years, and they had learned to value his counsel rather than fear his origins. At the chapel, Father Benedict stood ready to bless the new bell, his face serene with hard-won wisdom. Beside him waited a surprise visitor, a woman in traveling clothes, whose presence made Aaron stop short with recognition and wonder. "Lady Margaret of House Morwyn," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought your bloodline extinct." The elderly woman smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "As we thought yours was, Your Majesty, but some things endure beyond death, beyond time itself. When word reached us of your return, of your redemption, we knew the wheel of fate was finally turning toward justice." She approached with the careful dignity of true nobility, offering a formal curtsy that Aaron returned with a deep bow. "We have maintained our loyalty through 7 centuries of exile, Your Majesty. The old houses remember their oaths, remember the rightful king of Valdoria." "I am no longer the man who wore that crown," Aaron replied gently. "That king died with his kingdom. What stands before you is simply a husband who has learned to find joy in a small life lived with honor." "Perhaps," Lady Margaret said with a knowing smile, "but the blood remembers, and the people remember. Should you ever choose to reclaim what was stolen, you would not stand alone." The conversation was interrupted by the bell's first official peal, its voice rising clear and strong above the assembled crowd. Father Benedict spoke words of blessing and hope, his prayer encompassing not just the bronze instrument above them, but the community it would serve. "Let this bell call us to worship," the priest intoned, "but also to wisdom. Let it remind us that divine grace often comes in forms we do not expect, through people we might otherwise dismiss. Let it teach us to look beyond surface appearances to the truth of the heart." As the ceremony concluded, Elenora found herself standing with Aaron beneath the new bell, surrounded by neighbors who had become friends, by family who had learned to see past their prejudices, by a priest who had discovered that faith could grow stronger through questions rather than absolute certainties. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly, her hand finding his as the crowd began to disperse. "Choosing this small life over the crown you could reclaim?" Aaron's smile was radiant with contentment. "My beloved queen, I have learned that the greatest kingdoms are built not of territory and power, but of love and acceptance. Here in this village, with these people, with you I rule over riches no earthly crown could provide." The bell sang out again as if in agreement, its voice carrying across the valley like a promise of hope fulfilled and love redeemed. In the gathering twilight, Elenora and Aaron walked home together, their shadows finally falling side by side in the golden light, proof that even the most impossible transformations could become beautifully, perfectly real. The cracked bell that had once symbolized broken faith now hung silent in the museum Father Benedict had created, a reminder of what was possible when people chose love over fear, acceptance over judgment, and hope over despair. But above it, the new bell would ring each day at sunset, calling the village to remember that redemption, like love, could come to anyone brave enough to choose it.